Hello guys, how are you all? Welcome back to my channel. So, today we are gonna see, what if Luffy was a celestial dragon? Subscribe if you enjoy the video. And also check the description. So let's begin the story. The palace of the celestial dragons rose like a dream made of gold and ivory against a twilight sky, an opulent monument to power, legacy, and cruelty. Within its marbled corridors and under its jeweled ceilings, tradition and decadence intertwine to form a world where every glittering artifact masked a dark, suffocating truth. In the center of this glittering labyrinth lived a boy named Luffy, whose bright eyes and untamed spirit belied the gilded shackles of his birth. Luffy's earliest memories were painted with the hues of a life lived in excess. He recalled the soft echo of his laughter mingling with the clink of silver spoons on fine porcelain, the fragrant aroma of exotic spices carried through open archways, and the ceaseless hum of conversation filled with pompous declarations of superiority. Yet behind this dazzling veneer lay an undercurrent of cruelty, a system designed to keep the common people beneath an unyielding tyranny. Every corridor in the palace was lined with ornate carvings depicting the celestial dragons in scenes of majesty and conquest. Statues of ancestors, their expressions stern and inscrutable, towered over endless halls. Even as a child, Luffy sensed that the gilded walls held secrets of power and suffering, and that each smile and courteous bow concealed an unspoken hierarchy. This duality filled him with a quiet unease, a longing for freedom that clashed with the dictates of his noble birth. On a morning that began with a chorus of delicate flutes and whispered prayers, Luffy awoke in his spacious, sunlit chamber. Silk sheets, embroidered with the family crest, a soaring phoenix amidst swirling clouds, enveloped him, a daily reminder of his predestined place in the celestial order. Yet, as he swung his legs over the edge of the ornate bed, he wondered if destiny was truly written in stone, or if the heart could choose a different path. Luffy's room, a lavish space adorned with rare paintings and exotic relics, felt more like a gilded prison than a sanctuary. The walls, painted in deep shades of royal blue and accented with gold leaf, closed in on him with every passing day. He pressed his palm against the cool marble windowsill and peered out at the bustling city below, a city where the lives of the commoners were defined by struggle and hardship, in stark contrast to the effortless elegance of the celestial dragons. In the quiet solitude of his room, Luffy's mind often wandered to the stories his tutors had recited about the illustrious lineage of his family. Tales of battles fought in distant lands, of conquests won through both might and cunning, and of an unyielding belief in divine superiority were repeated with fervor. Yet, for all their grandeur, these stories stirred something unexpected within him, a sense of dissonance. How could such majestic history be built on a foundation of pain and subjugation? He recalled the stern lectures on duty and honor, each lesson punctuated by the heavy expectation that he would one day embody the noble virtues of his ancestors. But even as the words echoed in his ears, a rebellious ember flickered in his heart. It was not a flame born of defiance against tradition, but rather an innate desire for something more authentic, something that embraced the dignity of every individual, regardless of birth. In the early hours of one particular morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the lattice of the palace windows, Luffy sat cross-legged on the tatami mats in his private study. He gazed absently at a scroll that recounted the grand exploits of celestial heroes and yet found his thoughts drifting to the distant, muffled sounds of life beyond the palace walls. The gentle murmur of the servants preparing for another day, the clatter of boots in the corridor. It was all part of a world he had never truly known. "Master Luffy!" A soft, respectful voice called from the doorway. It was his nursemaid, a kind-hearted woman who had cared for him since infancy. "Breakfast is ready," Luffy smiled, rising slowly. "Thank you, Mama." Her gentle smile was tinged with the quiet understanding that Luffy harbored dreams too big for these gilded confines. Even though she knew little of the world beyond the palace, her heart ached with empathy for the young celestial dragon whose eyes shone with the spark of rebellion. As he walked down the hall, Luffy's bare feet felt the cool, polished marble, a sensation that made him acutely aware of the luxury that surrounded him. Yet it was a luxury that seemed increasingly oppressive, a shimmering facade hiding the injustices of a society built on the backs of the downtrodden. The dining hall was a grand affair, with long tables laden with sumptuous feasts, and crystal chandeliers casting rainbows of light across the room. Luffy took his seat at the head of the table, a position that reminded him of the weight of his legacy. Around him, elegantly dressed nobles exchanged polite greetings and whispered conspiracies about power and privilege. Yet beneath the surface of their refined smiles lay an unyielding arrogance, a belief that the commoners were nothing more than pawns in their elaborate game of superiority. As the meal progressed, Luffy listened to the familiar narratives of conquest and divine right, but his mind wandered to the stories of the people beyond the palace walls. He recalled fleeting images of ragged faces, of children playing in dusty alleys, of lives burdened by the heavy yoke of oppression. These visions, so distant from his own world, tugged at him with an almost unbearable intensity. "Luffy, you seem distracted today," remarked Lord Galen, a distant relative and one of the family's most ardent traditionalists. His tone was gentle enough, but his words carried an undercurrent of reprimand. "Focus on your lessons, on the duties you must one day uphold." Luffy met Lord Galen's gaze with a quiet defiance. "But my lord, how can I learn duty and honor when it seems that those very ideals have been twisted into a tool for oppression?" His voice, though soft, resonated with a sincerity that silenced the surrounding chatter. The room fell into an uncomfortable hush. Even the servants, who typically moved about without comment, paused in their duties to listen. Lord Galen's face darkened, and a chill seemed to descend upon the room. "Careful, Luffy," he said at length, his tone measured but icy. "There is a time for questions and a time for unquestioning loyalty. Remember that our legacy is built on centuries of tradition. To cast doubt on it is to cast doubt on your very soul." Yet in Luffy's heart, the embers of rebellion burned brighter. As he resumed his meal, each bite of delicacy felt like a reminder of the gilded chains that bound him. The sumptuous flavors were lost on him, overshadowed by the bitter taste of injustice that he sensed in every whispered conversation and every sidelong glance. That evening, as twilight draped the palace in hues of violet and gold, Luffy found solace in one of his secret retreats, a small, hidden terrace overlooking the sprawling city below. The terrace was his refuge, a place where he could escape the suffocating expectations of his birth and lose himself in the vast tapestry of the world beyond. From this vantage point, the city spread out like a living, breathing mosaic of light and shadow. The labyrinthine alleys, the bustling marketplaces, and the silent, sorrowful figures of the common folk moving through their daily struggles all stood in stark contrast to the unyielding grandeur of the palace behind him. It was a world that beckoned to him with a promise of freedom, a promise that was as tantalizing as it was dangerous. Luffy leaned on the cool stone balustrade, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the neon glow of distant lanterns mingled with the last blush of the dying sun. His thoughts churned with questions. Why was it that the world outside his door was so different from the perfection he was taught to revere? How could a system that celebrated divinity and honor also breed misery and despair? These questions, unasked and unanswerable within the confines of his education, raged in his mind like a storm. He recalled a conversation he had once overheard between two palace guards, men who rarely spoke of anything other than duty and protocol. "The commoners," one had whispered, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and disdain, "are like ants. They scurry about, living lives of hardship. They deserve nothing but our guidance." The other had snorted dismissively, but the words had lingered in Luffy's mind long after they were spoken. In that moment, the terrace became more than just a place of solitude. It transformed into a threshold between two worlds. One world was the golden cage of the celestial dragons, where every step was measured and every thought policed by centuries-old tradition. The other was the untamed, unpredictable realm of the common people, a realm where beauty and pain coexisted in a raw, unfiltered form. The wind whispered through the terrace, carrying with it the faint sounds of life from the streets below, the clamor of a distant market, the hushed cries of a woman mourning in the shadows, the rhythmic clatter of footsteps on cobblestone. Each sound was a reminder that beyond the opulence of the palace lay a world that had long forgotten the lies of inherited nobility. Inside, the palace was quiet now, the grand halls and ornate rooms empty of the day's chatter and ceremony. But in Luffy's mind, a quiet revolution was already stirring, a rebellion not of arms, but of ideas. He lay on his bed, staring at the intricately patterned ceiling, imagining it as a sky filled with endless possibility rather than the confines of his predetermined destiny. Sleep, when it came, was restless. In his dreams, he found himself wandering through crowded streets where voices of protest rose like a chorus of hope. He saw faces alight with determination, hands raised in defiance, and eyes that shone with the promise of change. The dream was vivid, a stark contrast to the sanitized narratives of honor and duty he had been taught. In his dream, the celestial dragons were not divine beings, but men and women burdened with the weight of their own hypocrisy. When morning arrived, Luffy awoke with a newfound resolve. The dreams had ignited something within him, a burning need to understand the true nature of the world, to see beyond the gilded lies and to embrace the raw, unvarnished truth of life. Yet he knew that the path ahead was fraught with peril. The palace was not merely a home. It was a fortress built on centuries of power, and any deviation from its doctrines was met with swift and merciless retribution. At breakfast, the tension was palpable. Luffy's mind still swirled with images of the city below, and the restless spirits of its inhabitants. The luxurious hall, with its high ceilings and sweeping murals, seemed to close in on him as he forced a smile and played his part in the ritualistic display of courtesy and entitlement. "Today, we discuss our family's legacy," declared a voice from the dais. Lord Alcide, a revered elder among the celestial dragons, stood before the assembled guests. His voice, though measured, carried the weight of unyielding tradition. "Our lineage has shaped the course of history, and it is our sacred duty to uphold the honor bestowed upon us by the gods." Luffy listened, his eyes drifting to a small, intricately designed window that offered a glimpse of the world outside. The words of duty and honor rang hollow against the backdrop of a city where suffering was a daily reality. A flicker of rebellion danced in his heart, a silent promise that someday he would find a way to break free from these chains of expectation. After the meal, while the others retreated to their studies and preparations for the day's rituals, Luffy lingered by the window. His reflection stared back at him, a young man with unkempt hair and eyes full of unspoken questions. In that mirror-like surface, he saw not the image of a proud, entitled noble, but that of someone yearning to explore the truth of his existence. "Luffy!" came a soft knock on the door. It was his closest attendant, a gentle soul named Aaron who had served the family for years. "You must join your lessons today," Luffy offered a wry smile. "I'll be there shortly, Aaron." "I'm just thinking." Aaron's eyes, kind and knowing, met his. "Thinking is dangerous in these halls, Master Luffy. There are questions that must remain unasked." Yet even as Aaron spoke, Luffy's heart pounded with the knowledge that some questions were too vital to silence. He wondered if one day he would be brave enough to voice the doubts that troubled him, to challenge a system that thrived on unquestioned loyalty. But for now, his thoughts remained his own, a secret rebellion in the stillness of his mind. As the day unfolded, Luffy moved through the palace with a quiet determination, each step heavy with the weight of his inner conflict. In the training yard, where young nobles practiced the art of combat with gleaming swords and practiced footwork, Luffy's movements were less about mastery of technique and more about the freedom of expression. His strikes were wild and unrefined, a stark contrast to the precise, disciplined forms of his peers. During a sparring session with one of the palace's most promising cadets, Luffy's frustration bubbled to the surface. The clash of swords and the grunts of exertion filled the air, yet his mind was elsewhere, wandering to the thought of a life unburdened by the legacy of oppression. When his opponent landed a heavy blow, Luffy staggered back, his eyes flashing with a fierce determination that left his opponent momentarily speechless. "Enough!" barked the instructor, a man with eyes as cold as polished steel. "You waste your energy with reckless abandon. You must channel your passion into precision." But Luffy's passion was not for the rigid confines of tradition. It was for a life that echoed the cries of the forgotten and the oppressed. As he sheathed his sword, he silently vowed that he would someday find a way to reconcile these two worlds, the world of glittering opulence and the raw, unfiltered life of the common folk. In a quiet moment later that day, while practicing alone in a secluded courtyard, Luffy allowed his guard to drop. He closed his eyes and let the sounds of nature wash over him, the rustle of leaves in a gentle breeze, the distant chirp of nightingales, and the soft murmur of his own heartbeat. In that solitude, the questions that had long haunted him coalesced into a single, burning thought. Freedom was not a privilege bestowed by birth but a right that belonged to every soul. A sudden, soft footfall interrupted his reverie. Turning, Luffy found himself face to face with a young servant, no more than a teenager, whose eyes held a mix of fear and hope. The servant's name was Taro, and he had often caught glimpses of Luffy during his secret ventures beyond the palace. "Master Luffy," Taro whispered, his voice trembling as if he were afraid to speak too loudly. "There are whispers among us in the lower quarters, whispers that you are not like the others." Luffy's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone gentle yet probing. Taro shifted nervously. "They say that you look out at the city with wonder, that you question the ways of our world. Some even say you dream of a life beyond these gilded halls." In that moment, Luffy saw in Taro's eyes a reflection of his own restless spirit, a longing for change, for a break in the endless cycle of oppression and entitlement. "And what do you believe, Taro?" Luffy inquired softly. The boy's gaze dropped to the ground before lifting again, filled with a quiet determination. "I believe that maybe, one day, things can be different. That even someone born in a gilded cage might find a way to set himself free." Those words, spoken in hushed tones amid the cool shadows of the courtyard, resonated deeply within Luffy. In that fleeting encounter, the seed of rebellion was planted, a seed nurtured by whispered hopes and the belief that even in the most opulent prisons, the human spirit could find a way to soar. Later that evening, as dusk bled into night and the palace corridors were lit by the soft glow of lanterns, Luffy found himself alone in a quiet library. Shelves upon shelves of ancient texts, scrolls, and manuscripts surrounded him, a treasure trove of knowledge accumulated over centuries. Here, in the silence of the written word, he sought answers to questions that the formal teachings of the celestial dragons refused to acknowledge. He ran his fingers over the spines of the books, feeling the weight of history in each carefully preserved volume. In one secluded corner, he discovered a tattered journal, a relic from a long-forgotten ancestor whose words hinted at a secret history, one that spoke of empathy, understanding, and the recognition that true nobility was measured not by birth, but by the choices one made. Luffy's eyes scanned the faded script, each line stirring a mixture of awe and sorrow. "Perhaps," he murmured to himself, "our legacy is not as unchangeable as we believe." The thought was as intoxicating as it was dangerous. To question the divine right of the celestial dragons was to challenge the very foundation of everything he had been taught. As he pored over the journal, his mind raced with possibilities. Could it be that the history of his people was not solely one of pride and conquest, but also of compassion and sacrifice? If so, then perhaps the path to true freedom lay not in renouncing his heritage entirely, but in reshaping it from within. The idea was radical and profoundly unsettling, but it stirred something inside him that he could no longer ignore. The library's heavy silence was broken only by the rustle of turning pages and the soft hum of distant voices from the upper corridors. Each word he read reinforced the conviction that he was not meant to be a puppet of tradition, but rather an architect of change, a beacon for those who had long suffered in the shadows of the celestial dragon's opulence. By the time night had fully descended, the palace had assumed an almost otherworldly quiet. The once bustling corridors now lay in slumber, the only sound the distant chime of a clock marking the passage of time. Luffy slipped out of the library, his thoughts a tangled web of hope and despair. The moon hung high in the sky, a silent witness to his internal tumult. He wandered through the silent halls, each step echoing softly against the marble floors, until he reached a secluded balcony overlooking the palace gardens. The gardens were a riot of nocturnal beauty, a symphony of fragrant blossoms, shadowed statues, and the gentle trickle of a fountain. Yet even this tranquil scene was marred by the awareness that every petal and every stone was part of an elaborate design meant to reinforce the power of his lineage. Luffy settled onto a stone bench, the cool night air brushing against his skin, and allowed himself a moment of introspection. The stars, unburdened by the pretensions of mortal ambition, shone with a clarity that made him feel small, and yet, in their distant brilliance, he sensed a call to something greater. The very heavens seemed to whisper of a destiny not dictated by birth, but forged in the crucible of individual will. He closed his eyes, letting the sound of the fountain and the rustle of leaves lull him into a state of quiet contemplation. In that moment, the palace was not a prison, but a canvas upon which he could paint a new future, A future where the golden cage of his heritage might one day be transformed into a sanctuary of true freedom. A place where the light of justice and equality could finally pierce through the shadows of oppression. But the path ahead was treacherous. Every act of defiance, every questioning glance, carried the risk of exposing him to dangers far beyond the confines of his current existence. The celestial dragons had thrived for centuries on the unchallenged belief that their lineage was sacred, that their right to rule was divinely ordained. To even hint at a different truth was to invite the wrath of a system that would stop at nothing to preserve its power. Yet even as the weight of destiny pressed down upon him, Luffy felt an undeniable thrill, a surge of adrenaline born of the promise of change. The rebellion stirring in his heart was not yet a raging inferno, but a steady, persistent flame that refused to be extinguished. It was the beginning of a journey, one that would force him to confront the deepest truths of his existence, and to question the very foundation upon which his world was built. As the night deepened and the palace slipped into a deeper sleep, Luffy remained on the balcony, a solitary figure bathed in moonlight. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs with the scent of jasmine and damp earth. In that quiet moment, he made a silent vow to himself, a promise that no matter how insurmountable the obstacles, he would not let the golden cage of his birth define him. The promise was simple yet profound: to seek truth in a world shrouded in lies, to find a path that honored both the legacy of his ancestors and the innate dignity of every human soul, and to forge a future where the power of compassion could triumph over the cruelty of tradition. In the distance, the faint sound of a flute, a melody both haunting and hopeful, drifted on the night air. It was a song of distant lands and forgotten dreams, a reminder that beyond the confines of the palace lay a world waiting to be discovered. Luffy listened intently, letting the notes wash over him, each one a call to arms for the heart and soul. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, lessons in the art of combat, formal ceremonies that celebrated the grandeur of the celestial dragons, and the ever-present scrutiny of those who expected nothing less than unquestioning loyalty. But tonight, under the vast expanse of the starlit sky, he allowed himself to dream. He dreamed of a day when the golden cage would no longer be a prison, but a stepping stone toward a life defined by choice, not by blood. As the first hints of dawn tinged the horizon with soft pinks and oranges, Luffy reluctantly rose from the bench. The night had been long, filled with introspection and a burgeoning resolve that would shape his future in ways he could scarcely imagine. With one last glance at the starlit sky, a sky that seemed to wink at him in silent encouragement, he stepped back into the palace, his footsteps echoing with newfound determination. He moved through the darkened corridors with a quiet urgency, the early morning stillness broken only by the soft rustle of his cloak and the distant call of a night bird. In his heart, he carried the memory of the dreams, the whispered hopes of Taro, and the secret promise he had made on that lonely balcony. Every step he took was a rebellion against the complacency of his gilded existence. When he reached his room, he paused at the door, his hand resting on the intricately carved knob. Beyond that door lay not just the comfort of a familiar space, but the culmination of generations of expectation, a destiny preordained by the weight of ancestral legacy. Yet within him, the seeds of change had taken root. The boy who had once seen the palace as a haven of luxury now viewed it with a critical eye, aware of its role as the architect of oppression. In the mirror, he saw the reflection of a young man caught between two worlds, the world of glittering privilege and the world of unspoken truths. His eyes, clear and determined, spoke of a resolve that was both fragile and fiercely unyielding. It was a look that promised transformation, a promise that one day, the golden cage would be shattered, and the true light of freedom would shine through. As the morning sun began to filter through the high windows of his room, casting a warm glow over the silken drapes and polished floors, Luffy took a deep breath. Today would be another day of lessons and rituals, of expectations and obligations. But today was also the first day of his journey towards something different, a journey that would force him to confront not only the rigid traditions of the celestial dragons but also the inner demons of doubt and fear. In that quiet moment, as the palace awoke around him and the day beckoned with its familiar routines, Luffy silently vowed that he would no longer be a passive inheritor of a cruel legacy. He would become the architect of his own destiny, a destiny defined by compassion, understanding, and the unyielding pursuit of truth. And so, with the promise of the night still echoing in his heart, and the first light of dawn illuminating a path toward an uncertain future, Luffy stepped out of his room, ready to face the day. Unbeknownst to him, each step he took was the first stroke in a rebellion that would one day shake the very foundations of the Celestial Dragon's empire. In the opulent halls of the palace, where every gesture was laden with the weight of expectation and every smile concealed a dagger of conformity, Luffy's journey had begun. The Golden Cage, with all its splendor and cruelty, was the stage upon which his inner conflict played out, a conflict that would soon erupt into a battle not just for his soul, but for the very essence of freedom in a world built on injustice. Thus, as the day advanced and the palace prepared to resume its elaborate dance of power and privilege, Luffy carried within him the hope of change, a hope as delicate and resilient as the first bloom of spring in a barren land. The Golden Cage might imprison his body, but it could never contain the restless spirit of a young heart yearning for liberation. The palace had barely recovered from the muted dawn of Luffy's newfound resolve when the first tremors of dissent began to stir beneath its gilded veneer. In the corridors, in quiet alcoves, and even in the hallowed halls where celestial dragons once recited ancient oaths of honor, murmurs had begun to echo, a symphony of discontent that threatened to shatter the oppressive silence of tradition. It was on such a day, heavy with unspoken tension, that Luffy first truly heard the whispers of rebellion. Earlier that morning, before the lavish breakfast had given way to the formalities of court, Luffy had been summoned to accompany a small contingent on a royal procession, a journey through the inner quarters of the palace that few of his peers ever experienced. The procession was said to be a demonstration of benevolence, a way to remind the lower servants and attendants of the celestial dragon's gracious rule. Yet for Luffy, whose heart was already torn between the gilded chains of his birth and the distant, aching cries of the oppressed, this was an opportunity to witness firsthand the contradictions of his world. Clad in ceremonial attire that sparkled with the insignias of his lineage, Luffy walked in step with his elders. The corridors were lit by torches that cast long, dancing shadows on walls adorned with portraits of forebears. Every step was measured, every gesture steeped in the rituals of subservience and pride. Yet even as his polished shoes clicked against the cold marble floors, Luffy's mind wandered. He had learned long ago that beauty could be a mask that concealed suffering behind each ornamental detail. The procession led them through a lesser-known wing of the palace, a part reserved for the servants and commoners whose loyalty and silence fed the opulence of celestial rule. Here, the atmosphere was palpably different. The corridors were narrower, the light dimmer, and the air carried a mix of dust and despair. As they passed, Luffy's eyes could not help but catch sight of the laborers at work, their faces drawn and weary, barely glancing up as they performed their assigned tasks. A particular tableau struck him with a sudden force. A group of servants gathered in a cramped courtyard, their hands calloused from unrelenting labor, their eyes reflecting a silent plea. Luffy's heart clenched at the sight, a stark contrast to the polished perfection of the royal halls he'd left behind. One servant in particular, a young woman with soot-stained cheeks and defiant eyes, met his gaze for a fraction of a second before looking away. In that brief, wordless exchange, Luffy sensed a story of hidden agony and desperate hope. "Keep your eyes forward, boy," hissed a voice at his side. He turned to see a stern-faced guard, his eyes hard and unyielding. The guard's tone was low and menacing, a reminder that within these walls even a glimpse of sympathy for the commoners was forbidden. Luffy forced himself to look away, but the image of that young servant lingered, etched into his mind like a spark waiting to ignite. The procession wound its way through a secluded part of the palace grounds, past a series of arched doorways that opened into an inner courtyard. It was here, amid the silence and the muted sounds of servants at work, that an incident unfolded. A moment that would mark a turning point in Luffy's internal struggle. A commotion erupted near a side entrance to a storeroom. Luffy's ears caught the muffled sounds of a struggle, a raised voice, the clatter of falling objects, and then the harsh, ragged cry of pain. The crowd that had gathered in the courtyard fell into a hush, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation and dread. Luffy, drawn by both curiosity and a stirring sense of duty, edged closer. Hidden behind a decorative column, he peered into the open doorway and saw a scene that made his blood run cold. A group of palace guards, faces twisted in the grimace of authority, were dragging a middle-aged man, one of the lowly attendants who worked in the storeroom, by his collar. The man's eyes were wide with terror, his limbs flailing feebly in a futile bid for escape. The guards sneered and jeered, their voices carrying a venomous mixture of cruelty and entitlement. "You dare delay the orders?" One guard spat, his hand gripping the man's shirt roughly. "You're nothing but a vermin, unworthy of the light of the celestial legacy." The man's protest was lost in the cacophony of shouts. His words were a desperate jumble of apology and defiance, as he pleaded for mercy that would not come. The cruelty of the moment struck Luffy like a physical blow. His stomach churned, and his fists clenched involuntarily at the sight of such unmitigated inhumanity. Unable to stand idly by, Luffy's instincts screamed at him to intervene, to reach out and help this broken soul. But he was tethered by the invisible chains of his birth, a child of the celestial dragons who dared not cross the line set by tradition. Still, the image of the suffering man haunted him, gnawing at the fragile walls of the indoctrination that had been built around him since birth. After a long, agonizing moment, the guards finally cast the man aside, their cruelty unabated as they resumed their march. The man crumpled to the ground, his face contorted in pain and despair, his body a mute testament to the tyranny that ruled these halls. As the procession continued, the whispers of discontent among the servants grew louder, a chorus of sorrow and simmering rebellion that only those with a compassionate heart could hear. Luffy's mind raced with questions. How could a system that celebrated divine heritage condone such brutality? Was honor and nobility meant to be defined by the suffering of others? The answers were not easily found in the sermons of his tutors or the ornate texts of his ancestors. Instead, they were whispered in the broken voices of the oppressed, voices that were beginning to echo in the depths of his conscience. That very afternoon, as the palace resumed its daily rhythms of ritual and duty, Luffy found himself unable to shake the images from his mind. The memory of the abused attendant haunted him, an indelible stain upon the immaculate tapestry of celestial pride. It was during a lull in his formal studies that he encountered someone who would offer him a glimpse into the forbidden truths of the world beyond the palace walls. In a dim corridor near the servants' quarters, a place where silence reigned and the echoes of whispered secrets were as common as the rustle of linens, Luffy came face to face with Mira. Mira was a servant of quiet dignity, with eyes that shimmered with hidden depths and a gentle smile that belied the harshness of her reality. She moved with a grace that suggested she had seen far more than her station would allow, and her presence was at once comforting and disquieting. "Mr. Luffy," she said softly, her voice a tender murmur that seemed to come from a world apart from the harsh clangor of authority. "You've been looking troubled lately." Luffy hesitated before answering, uncertain how much of his inner turmoil he could reveal to someone whose life had been so intricately woven into the tapestry of oppression. I've been thinking," he began, his words measured and cautious, "about our duties, our legacy, and the price others pay for it." Myra's eyes softened with empathy as she led him to a quiet alcove away from prying ears. "They do not tell you the whole truth, do they?" she whispered. "The celestial dragon's world is built on many things, glory, yes, but also suffering. You have seen what happens to those who serve in the shadows, the forgotten souls who carry the weight of our world without ever being allowed to speak of it." Her words resonated deeply within Luffy. As she recounted the silent tragedies hidden behind the palace's grandeur, he began to piece together a mosaic of injustice that spanned generations. Mira spoke of families torn apart by poverty, of lives reduced to servitude and despair, and of dreams crushed under the heavy boot of tradition. Each word was a revelation, a shard of truth that shattered the carefully constructed illusions of his upbringing. "I never asked for this life," Luffy confessed, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "But I was born into it, and I feel powerless to change it." Mira reached out and gently placed a hand on his arm. "Change begins with awareness, and rebellion begins with the courage to question. Do not let them convince you that your birth defines your destiny. There is strength in compassion, and the whispers of our people are growing louder each day." Her words were like seeds planted in the fertile soil of Luffy's heart. That evening, as he lay in the quiet solitude of his chamber, the memory of Myra's gentle admonitions mingled with the raw pain of the day's events. In his dreams, he saw images of a world transformed, a realm where the oppressed were no longer silenced by fear, where the voices of the meek rose in a chorus of defiance against tyranny. In the days that followed, Luffy's inner world began to shift in ways that were both exhilarating and terrifying. The image of the abused attendant and the whispered truths shared by Mira ignited a burning curiosity within him, a desire to see the world not as it was dictated by tradition, but as it truly existed beyond the gilded facade of the celestial dragons. During quiet moments between his formal lessons, Luffy found himself drifting away from the prescribed narratives of honor and divine right. Instead, his mind wandered to the secret corners of the palace, to the murmurs of discontent that resonated in the hidden passages and servants' quarters. Each whispered conversation, each furtive glance exchanged in shadowed corridors, became a part of a tapestry of rebellion that he was only beginning to comprehend. One afternoon, as he sat near a stained glass window in the private gardens, a place that offered a rare glimpse of unfiltered sunlight and the wild beauty of nature, Luffy encountered another soul whose path had been shaped by suffering. An elderly gardener, his hands worn and rough from decades of labor, tended to a modest patch of vibrant wildflowers. The gardener's eyes, though lined with age and sorrow, shone with a quiet dignity. "Master Luffy," the gardener said, nodding respectfully as he noticed the young noble lingering by the garden's edge. "The flowers bloom, even in the harshest conditions. They remind us that beauty can arise from the most unlikely places." Luffy regarded him thoughtfully. "But why must beauty come at such a cost?" he asked, the question tumbling out in a rush of emotion. "Every petal, every bloom, is nurtured by pain and toil, pain that no noble ceremony can ever erase." The gardener paused, his gaze drifting over the riot of colors before him. "True beauty is born of struggle," he replied softly. "And sometimes it is in the struggle itself that we find the seeds of change. Listen carefully, Master Luffy. The world speaks to those who are willing to hear its truth." Those words echoed in Luffy's mind long after the gardener had moved on. They mingled with the memories of Myra's secret whispers and the haunting cries of the oppressed. Slowly, like the first fragile buds of spring emerging from a winter's frost, a seed of doubt began to germinate within him, a doubt that questioned the very foundations of his upbringing. Back in the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, where every stone seemed to hold a secret and every shadow concealed a story, Luffy found that the whispers of rebellion were not confined to the lower quarters. Even among the noble circles, murmurs of discontent had begun to surface, quiet, tentative conversations about the future, about a change that might one day sweep away the oppressive traditions of the past. Late one evening, after a day filled with the rigid recitations of ancient oaths and the weighty lessons of duty, Luffy wandered into a secluded courtyard he had never visited before. There, beneath the soft glow of moonlight, he overheard a conversation between two young nobles, their voices low and conspiratorial. "I heard that the ministers in the outer provinces have begun to question the old ways," one whispered. "They say that the suffering of the commoners cannot be ignored any longer." The other nodded, his eyes dark with apprehension. "But if we speak too loudly, if our voices are heard, it could mean our undoing. The traditions run deep. They have built these walls, not just of stone and gold, but of fear and subjugation." Luffy pressed himself against a cool stone wall, his heart pounding as he listened. These were not the idle fancies of discontent, but the cautious stirrings of a revolution, an acknowledgement that the time for blind obedience was drawing to a close. For the first time, he realized that the whispers of rebellion were not confined to the lower classes. Even within the hallowed halls of his birth, doubts festered like a quiet, dangerous flame. That night, as Luffy returned to his chamber, the voices of the courtyards and corridors mingled with the steady beat of his own heart. In the solitude of his room, he replayed the fragments of conversation in his mind. Could it be that the celestial dragon's legacy, so carefully preserved and venerated, was built on a foundation that was anything but righteous? Could the power they wield be as brittle as it was oppressive? The questions tormented him as he lay awake, the silence around him broken only by the rhythmic ticking of an ornate clock. Every tick was a reminder of time slipping away, a time in which he might be forced to choose between the comfort of tradition and the uncertain promise of change. The next day brought with it the bittersweet light of early autumn, a season of transition that mirrored the inner transformation stirring within Luffy. During a rare moment of respite from the formalities of court, he found himself wandering near the palace's outer wall, where the cultivated gardens gave way to untamed groves. Here, away from the scrutinizing eyes of his peers, he felt a tentative freedom, a fragile space where his thoughts could roam unencumbered. It was here that he encountered Riko, a young commoner who had, through some twist of fate, found herself working as an assistant in the palace kitchens. Riko was unlike anyone Luffy had met before. Her spirit, though tempered by hardship, radiated a quiet resilience. Her eyes sparkled with mischief and determination, a combination that belied her lowly station. Riko was busy carrying a tray laden with fresh bread when their paths crossed. The moment their eyes met, time seemed to slow. In her gaze, Luffy saw not deference or fear, but a spark of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of shared burdens. "Master Luffy," Riko said, her tone casual yet laced with a boldness that took him by surprise. "I've noticed you wandering the gardens more than usual. Seeking something?" Luffy managed a wry smile, his heart beating faster at her directness. "Perhaps I am," he replied softly. "I wonder if there is more to life than what these walls allow us to see." Riko's smile deepened, and for a moment, the roles of master and servant seemed to blur in the cool autumn air. "There is always more, if you have the courage to look," she said. "I've seen things, secrets in the shadows. People who dream of freedom, who whisper of change when the night is darkest." Her words struck a chord within Luffy. Here was someone who not only recognized the injustice of the world but dared to speak of it. "Tell me," he urged, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what you know." Riko glanced around furtively before leaning in closer. "There are meetings," she confided. "Quiet gatherings in the abandoned halls beyond the servants' quarters. People from all walks of life, nobles who question, servants who suffer, come together to share their hopes for a different future. They call it the Gathering of the Whispers." A thrill of excitement and dread surged through Luffy. The very notion that even within the impervious walls of the Celestial Dragons, a seed of rebellion could take root was both terrifying and exhilarating. "And you believe this change can come?" he asked, his voice trembling with the weight of his own longing. Riko's eyes shone with unyielding determination. "I believe that when enough voices speak as one, even the most ancient traditions can crumble. We have nothing to lose, and everything to gain." For a long moment, they stood together in the twilight, two souls bound by the shared promise of change. In that fleeting encounter, Luffy realized that rebellion was not an abstract concept taught in hushed lectures. It was a living, breathing force, growing stronger with every whispered word and every act of quiet defiance. That night, as Luffy retreated to his chamber, the weight of the day's revelations pressed upon him. The images of cruelty, the secret meetings, and the candid words of Riko converged into a maelstrom of thoughts and emotions. In the dim light of his room, he sat at his desk, parchment and ink spread out before him, and began to write, a desperate attempt to capture the chaos of his feelings and the urgency of the questions that now defined his every thought. He wrote of the suffering he had witnessed in the hidden corners of the palace, of the small acts of kindness that defied the cruelty of tradition, and of the whispered promises of a future where compassion reigned over tyranny. Each stroke of the pen was a small act of defiance, a rebellion against the narratives that had been imposed upon him since birth. Yet even as he poured his heart onto the paper, Luffy felt the ever-looming presence of danger. To record these thoughts was to risk everything, his future, his identity, and perhaps even his life. But the desire for truth and the need for change burned too fiercely to be silenced by fear. In that moment, he vowed to himself that he would not be complicit in the injustices that had haunted him for so long. In the days that followed, the palace buzzed with subtle changes. Whispers of discontent had grown louder, echoing in corridors and shared in furtive glances. Even those who had long accepted the celestial order found themselves questioning the moral cost of their luxurious existence. For Luffy, every conversation, every sidelong look, became a reminder that rebellion was not a solitary endeavor. It was a shared longing, a collective heartbeat beneath the veneer of nobility. During one of the many banquets held to celebrate the lineage of the Celestial Dragons, Luffy sat at the long table, surrounded by relatives and dignitaries whose faces were etched with centuries of entitlement. Yet beneath the gilded masks, he sensed a palpable tension. At intervals, a hushed murmur would ripple through the room, and discreet glances would be exchanged. It was as if every guest harbored a secret, a silent acknowledgement of the cost at which their splendor was built. As the chief orator extolled the virtues of ancestral glory, Luffy's mind drifted back to the image of the abused attendant and the fervent words of Mira, Rico, and the gardener. In the quiet spaces between the formalities, he allowed himself to wonder, what if the time had come to let those whispers grow into a roar? What if the golden cage was not a sanctuary at all, but a prison that could, and must, be shattered? After the banquet, while the formal celebrations continued in the grand halls, Luffy sought solace in a secluded corridor behind the dining area. There, he encountered a fellow noble, Armand, a young man whose eyes burned with a similar, secret fire. Armand leaned in, his voice barely audible. "Luffy, have you ever wondered if our traditions are worth the price they extract?" he whispered, his words trembling with both fear and hope. Luffy's pulse quickened. "Every day," he replied, his voice laced with a quiet urgency. "But I fear that speaking our truths might bring us nothing but ruin." Armand's eyes glimmered with a fierce determination. "Perhaps, but what is a life lived in quiet submission compared to one lived in the pursuit of justice?" he challenged softly. "I've heard talk of meetings, of a group that dares to imagine a new world. I thought you might know something of it." Luffy nodded slowly, the gravity of the conversation sinking in. "I have heard whispers," he admitted, "but I have not dared to venture beyond the safety of my station. Yet, if there is even a chance for change, I must learn more." The conversation left Luffy with a mixture of exhilaration and dread, a potent brew that stirred his soul. In that moment, he realized that the call to rebellion was not an isolated spark. It was a conflagration waiting to engulf everything in its path. And though the consequences could be dire, the alternative, a life lived in blind servitude to a corrupt tradition, was far more unbearable. In the quiet solitude of his study later that night, Luffy pored over ancient manuscripts and forbidden texts that he had secretly gathered over the past few weeks. These texts, relics of a time when compassion and justice were not yet smothered by the weight of absolute power, hinted at a world where the nobility of spirit was defined not by birth but by actions. The more he read, the more the cracks in the celestial dragon's narrative appeared before him, revealing a tapestry woven with both light and dark threads. One passage, in particular, resonated with him deeply. "The true measure of a soul is not in the blood it bears, but in the courage to stand for what is right, even when it means defying the heavens." Those words, nearly lost among the archaic symbols and faded ink, ignited a fire within Luffy. They were a beacon in the oppressive darkness, urging him to rise above the complacency of his inherited privilege and to become a harbinger of change. But with every step toward this unknown future came the risk of exposure. The palace was a fortress of secrets, and any deviation from the sanctioned path was met with swift and unyielding retribution. Luffy knew that he must tread carefully, for every whisper of dissent, every fleeting conversation, was a dangerous spark that could set the entire empire ablaze. It was on a cool, windswept evening, when the stars themselves seemed to murmur of ancient rebellions, that fate intervened in a way Luffy could never have foreseen. While walking along a secluded path near the eastern wall of the palace, he was accosted by a hooded figure emerging from the shadows. The stranger's face was obscured by a dark cloak, and for a moment, Luffy's heart raced in alarm. "Who are you?" Luffy demanded, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. The stranger paused, then spoke in a low, measured tone. "I am but a messenger, a bearer of truths that have been hidden for too long. I have seen your eyes, young master, and I know you carry the weight of unspoken questions." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the whisper of the wind. Then the stranger continued. "There is a gathering, a secret assembly of those who dare to dream of a new world. They call themselves the Children of the Dawn, and they believe that change can only come from within. If you wish to know more, seek me by the old fountain in the lower quarters at midnight. There, truths will be revealed." With that, the hooded figure melted into the darkness, leaving Luffy trembling, not just from fear, but from the exhilarating promise of transformation. Every word, every syllable of that encounter resonated with him. The idea of joining a clandestine assembly, of standing shoulder to shoulder with those who refused to bow to tyranny, was intoxicating. That night, as Luffy lay awake in his chamber, the image of the hooded messenger danced in his mind. He envisioned a future where the whispers of rebellion grew into a clarion call, where the celestial dragon's gilded empire would tremble beneath the might of a people united by hope and determination. And with each heartbeat, his resolve hardened. He would go to the lower quarters, he would seek the truth, and he would embrace the call to rebellion, even if it meant risking everything he had ever known. When midnight finally arrived, Luffy's heart pounded like a drum as he made his way through the labyrinthine corridors toward the old fountain in the lower quarters, a place where the light of the polished chandeliers gave way to the raw, unfiltered darkness of reality. Every step was a defiant act, a silent rejection of the life that had been chosen for him. The lower quarters were a stark contrast to the opulence of the upper halls. Here, the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and the faint odor of oil lamps burning low. The walls, rough and unadorned, bore the scars of countless hardships endured by those who lived outside the protective embrace of the celestial palace. As Luffy approached the old fountain, a crumbling relic of an age long past, he found a small group of individuals gathered in a tight circle. Their faces, illuminated only by the flickering light of a single lantern, were etched with determination and quiet defiance. Among them stood a woman with eyes like burning coals, her presence commanding silence and respect. "Welcome," she said in a voice that was both gentle and resolute. "I am Selene, and we are the children of the dawn. We have gathered here because we can no longer bear the weight of injustice. We seek a future where every soul is valued, where the tyranny of the old ways is swept away by the winds of change." Luffy listened, enraptured by her words. For the first time, he felt that his inner rebellion was not a solitary burden but part of a larger, collective struggle, a struggle that spanned the hidden layers of the empire. Here, in this secret meeting, he found others who had dared to question, who had dared to dream of a life unshackled by inherited cruelty. Selene's voice rose and fell as she recounted the stories of suffering and resilience that had fueled the spark of rebellion. She spoke of families ruined by the merciless demands of the aristocracy, of communities that had been forced into silence by fear and oppression, and of a hope that had grown in the dark crevices of despair. With every word, Luffy felt a growing resolve. The rebellion was no longer a distant, abstract idea. It was a tangible, living force that beckoned him to act. When the meeting finally drew to a close, Selene approached Luffy. "You have the look of one who carries both burden and hope," she said softly. "Know that here you are not alone. But remember, the path we tread is dangerous, and there will be sacrifices. Are you willing to risk everything for the truth?" Luffy met her gaze steadily. "Yes," he replied, the word both an affirmation and a challenge. "I want to help. I want to see the dawn of a new day." Selene's eyes sparkled with quiet approval. "Then join us. Let the whispers of rebellion become a roar that will shake the foundations of this empire." In that moment, standing beneath the crumbling arches of the lower quarters, Luffy felt the weight of destiny settle upon him. The choice was made. He would no longer be a silent bystander in a world built on cruelty. He would become a voice for the voiceless, a beacon for those trapped in the darkness of oppression. The days that followed were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings and secret exchanges of information. Luffy's every movement was now marked by the ever-present danger of discovery. Yet with each whispered conversation and each shared hope, his determination grew. He began to frequent the hidden alcoves and shadowed passageways where the children of the dawn gathered, learning the intricacies of their plans and the sacrifices that lay ahead. Each meeting was a study in both camaraderie and caution. The rebels came from all walks of life. Some were former servants, others were disillusioned nobles, and still others were individuals who had long suffered in silence. They shared their personal stories of injustice and loss, forging bonds through the mutual understanding that the old order was irreparably broken. One evening, as rain pelted the narrow windows of a secret meeting room, Luffy listened intently to the story of Tomas, a man who had once been a trusted advisor in the palace. Tomas recounted how he had witnessed the cruelty of the upper echelons firsthand, how decisions made in opulent halls had led to the suffering of countless innocent lives. His voice trembled with both sorrow and determination as he described the moment. He could bear the hypocrisy no longer. "Every day, I would see children with eyes too old for their age, mothers weeping silently as their families were torn apart by greed," Tomas said, his gaze distant as if reliving the horrors. I can no longer serve a system that values wealth over human life. I had to leave everything behind to stand for what is right. Luffy's heart ached at Tomasa's words, and in that moment, he realized that the rebellion was not simply an act of defiance. It was a necessary step toward reclaiming humanity from the clutches of a corrupt regime. The cost of awakening was high, but the alternative, continued silence, was far more devastating. That night, as Luffy lay in his modest quarters far from the splendor of his childhood home, he stared up at the fractured ceiling. The whispers of rebellion had taken root in his soul, and he knew that every choice henceforth would be measured against the lives of those who had suffered in silence. The path ahead was fraught with peril, but the promise of a future where justice reigned was a light too bright to ignore. With each passing day, the inner workings of the rebellion grew more complex. Secret messages were exchanged, safe houses were established, and the network of dissenters expanded. Luffy found himself drawn deeper into this clandestine world, his very identity shifting from that of a reluctant noble to an active participant in a movement that sought to rewrite the rules of destiny. During a particularly intense session in an abandoned storeroom beneath the palace, Luffy was tasked with delivering an important message to one of the rebel leaders stationed near the outer walls. As he navigated the dim corridors, his every step was accompanied by the steady thrum of his heartbeat and the constant awareness of danger. The air was heavy with anticipation, a promise that nothing would ever be the same again. When he finally reached his destination, he was greeted by a small group of rebels huddled around a flickering lamp. Their eyes, filled with a mixture of hope and defiance, recognized in him the spark of change. Luffy recited the message, a call for unity and a plea for courage, his voice resonating with the determination of a man who had chosen his own destiny. That night, as he walked back through the silent halls, the echoes of his footsteps mingled with the faint, yet unmistakable, cadence of his new conviction. The whispers of rebellion were no longer distant murmurs. They had become a part of him, a driving force that promised to transform not only his life but the fate of an entire empire. As weeks turned into months, the quiet rebellion grew bolder. The once muted whispers became a steady current of hope that flowed through the lower quarters and seeped into the very foundations of the palace. Luffy, now deeply enmeshed in the movement, began to envision a future where the chains of tradition would be replaced by bonds of unity and equality. Late at night, when the world was cloaked in darkness and the only sound was the gentle murmur of the wind, Luffy would often return to the memory of that fateful procession, the day he first witnessed cruelty, the moment he heard Myra's gentle truths, and the midnight meeting beneath the old fountain. Each memory was a reminder that rebellion was not an act of anger, but an act of hope, a promise that even in the deepest shadows, a single voice of defiance could spark a revolution. And so, as the whispers of rebellion spread like wildfire through the heart of the empire, Luffy embraced his role with a fierce determination. He knew that the road ahead would be perilous, that sacrifices would be demanded, and lives might be lost. But the vision of a world reborn, one where every soul was cherished, where justice and compassion reigned, was worth every risk. In the quiet hours before dawn, as he sat by a window watching the first rays of sunlight break through the darkness, Luffy allowed himself to dream. He dreamed of a day when the Celestial Dragon's gilded prison would be nothing more than a relic of a bygone era, a day when the whispers of rebellion would finally rise into a triumphant roar that reshaped the destiny of his people. Now, as the rebellion continued to grow in the hidden corners of the palace and beyond, Luffy found solace in the belief that change was not only possible, it was inevitable. The whispers of dissent, once fragile and tentative, had become a powerful force that challenged the very foundation of a corrupt legacy. Each act of kindness toward the oppressed, each moment of solidarity with a fellow rebel, was a step toward reclaiming a future that belonged to all, not just to those born into privilege. The weight of tradition, so long accepted without question, now seemed a burden too heavy to bear. And in its place, a new legacy was being forged, a legacy built on the courage to speak out, the determination to stand against tyranny, and the unwavering belief that every life, no matter how humble, held the power to ignite a revolution. As Luffy looked toward the horizon, where the first light of a new day mingled with the hope of countless hearts, he felt a quiet certainty. The golden cage of the past was beginning to crack, and in those fissures, the seeds of a brighter, freer future were taking root. That evening, As the palace prepared for another night of silent rituals and unspoken secrets, Luffy found himself once again in the sanctuary of the Hidden Garden, a place where the voices of nature and rebellion intertwined. The soft rustling of leaves, the murmur of a distant fountain, and the subtle glow of fireflies all served as a reminder that life, in all its raw and imperfect beauty, was a force too resilient to be contained. Sitting on a stone bench beneath an ancient tree, Luffy closed his eyes and let the whispers of rebellion wash over him. He could almost hear the collective heartbeat of those who dared to dream of change, the quiet murmur of hope that, one day, would rise into an unstoppable tide of transformation. In that moment of quiet introspection, he vowed to carry the torch of rebellion, to nurture every whisper of dissent until it became a blazing beacon of truth. And so, with the cool night air enveloping him and the promise of a new dawn stirring in his heart, Luffy embraced the path that lay ahead. The whispers of rebellion, once mere echoes in the corridors of an ancient palace, had grown into a rallying cry, a call to arms that would one day shatter the chains of injustice and light the way to a future where every soul was free. The days following the midnight meeting had passed in a blur of half-whispered conversations and stolen glances in dark corridors. Luffy felt as if the very fabric of his world was shifting beneath him. The rebellion that had first whispered its promises of change was now gathering strength, and with it came bonds that defied the centuries-old edicts of the celestial dragons. Among those bonds, one connection shone with a light both dangerous and mesmerizing, a connection that was forbidden by every law of the palace and every command of tradition. It was on an evening when the palace lay hushed under a veil of twilight that Luffy first encountered her again, Rico, the spirited commoner he had met in the garden just days before. The encounter was unplanned, a fleeting moment that nevertheless would mark the beginning of an unbreakable tether between two souls destined to clash with an unjust world. Luffy had sought refuge in one of the palace's quieter corridors, far from the eyes of his superiors, his thoughts still echoing with the promises of the Children of the Dawn. The corridor was dimly lit by sconces whose soft amber glow barely penetrated the heavy shadows. Every stone, every carved relief, seemed to murmur secrets of ancient rule and whispered rebellion. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with a figure emerging from the darkness, a girl with eyes that glimmered like the embers of a dying fire, yet burned with a determined spark. "Master Luffy," she said softly, her voice carrying both a note of caution and an unmistakable warmth. In that moment, all the fears and uncertainties he had harbored melted away into a single, striking realization. This connection was not dictated by rank or duty, but by the raw, untamed honesty of their hearts. For Rico, whose life had been defined by struggle and survival in the lower echelons of the palace, the sight of a celestial dragon moving quietly through the corridors was a wonder in itself, a symbol of both forbidden beauty and forbidden hope. Her dark eyes searched his, as though trying to read the tumult of emotions swirling within him. "Rico," Luffy began, hesitating as if each syllable carried the weight of centuries. "I did not expect." She held up a hand, silencing him with a gentle smile. "You need not speak so formally with me," she replied, her tone imbued with an intimacy that was both comforting and defiant. "We are not defined solely by our names or our birthright." In that moment, a fragile bridge was built between the worlds of nobility and commoner, a bridge constructed from shared dreams and a mutual yearning for something more. As the night deepened, they found themselves leaning against the cool stone wall, their voices hushed as they exchanged stories that were as disparate as they were interwoven. Rico spoke of the hardships that had marked her every day, the unyielding labor in the kitchens, the unspoken cruelty of a system designed to keep her subservient, and the clandestine glimmers of resistance that had allowed hope to flicker in the dark. Luffy, in turn, revealed the restless thoughts that had begun to haunt him since that fateful procession, a procession where he had witnessed cruelty so raw it had seared itself into his memory. Their conversation was a delicate dance on a razor's edge. Each word, each whispered confession, defied the rigid boundaries of their worlds. For Luffy, who had been raised on the ideals of honor and duty, these exchanges stirred something deep within him, a yearning to embrace his humanity, to see the world not through the lens of inherited privilege, but through the eyes of someone who had tasted both suffering and hope. In the days that followed, Luffy found himself drawn irresistibly to Rico. Their encounters, though always cloaked in the secrecy demanded by the palace's unforgiving gaze, became more frequent, more daring. They would meet in hidden alcoves behind towering hedges in the garden, in the quiet recesses of neglected corridors, and sometimes even in the hushed moments just before dawn when the palace slept unaware of its own decay. One such morning, as pale light crept across the marble floors of an abandoned servants' passage, Luffy and Rico met in secret. They sat side by side on a crumbling stone bench, the cool air of early morning mingling with the heady aroma of dew and earth. "Do you ever wonder," Rico began softly, her eyes fixed on the emerging light, "if the life we lead is the only life there is? That maybe, beyond these suffocating walls, there is a world where we are not defined by our birth or our station." Luffy's gaze met hers, and for a long moment, the silent language of shared dreams passed between them. "I do," he admitted. "I see a future where honor isn't measured by cruelty, where strength is found in compassion rather than domination. Every day, I wake up with that thought burning inside me, a desire to break free." Her hand brushed against his, a contact so fleeting and yet charged with meaning that Luffy felt the spark of rebellion ignite anew. "Then we must be brave," she whispered. "Even if our connection is forbidden, even if every law and every tradition says we should remain apart, our hearts know the truth." In that instant, the notion of forbidden lost its sting, replaced by a fierce conviction that the connection they shared was not a transgression, but a necessity. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to bring them together, a celestial dragon and a humble servant, united by a mutual recognition of the corruption around them and a promise of a brighter, freer tomorrow. As weeks turned into months, Luffy and Rico's clandestine meetings evolved into a secret refuge, a sanctuary where the weight of the world could be momentarily lifted. In these stolen hours, they explored the hidden corners of the palace that few even knew existed. They discovered ancient murals and forgotten chambers, each depicting a time when the celestial dragons were revered not for their unassailable power, but for their wisdom and benevolence. They found dusty scrolls tucked away in neglected libraries that hinted at a different legacy, a legacy of compassion, of justice, and of an unwavering belief in the potential for change. In one such hidden chamber, beneath an arched ceiling adorned with faded stars, Luffy and Rico huddled over a brittle manuscript. The fragile pages told the story of a celestial ancestor who had once dared to question the dogmas of his time, a man whose heart had been as wild and free as the ocean. Luffy's fingers traced the ancient symbols as Rico's eyes shone with wonder. It was as if they were reading not just words, but a map to their own souls, a guide to understanding that nobility was not the inheritance of blood alone, but the inheritance of one's actions. "Imagine," Rico breathed, "if we could rewrite this story, not erase our past, but transform it into something new, something that honors every life, every struggle." Luffy nodded, his gaze distant as if he could see a future unfolding before him. "I want that future, Rico. I want to tear down the walls of this golden prison and build something that truly reflects the spirit of every person, noble or not." Their shared dreams were dangerous, for even a single word of dissent could unravel the carefully maintained order of the palace. Yet the more they shared, the more their forbidden connection grew, forging a bond that was both exhilarating and perilous. Each meeting became an act of defiance, a declaration that the old world's rules were not absolute, and that love, in its most unbridled form, could transcend even the most deeply entrenched hierarchies. The connection between Luffy and Rico did not go unnoticed by those with eyes attuned to the undercurrents of dissent. In the labyrinthine corridors of the palace, where every secret was guarded with an almost sacred vigilance, rumors began to circulate. Some whispered that the young celestial dragon had become too soft, that his heart was straying from the cold doctrines of his lineage. Others murmured of an illicit relationship, of forbidden ties that could bring ruin not only to an individual but to the very institution of the celestial dragons. One chilly evening, as Luffy returned from a secret rendezvous with Rico, he found himself intercepted by one of his distant cousins, a man whose loyalty to tradition was as fierce as his disdain for any deviation from it. Lord Galen, with his eyes as hard as carved stone, studied Luffy intently. "I have heard unsettling things, Luffy," Lord Galen said in a low, measured tone that brooked no argument. "There are whispers that you are fraternizing with those who are beneath you. Do not mistake sympathy for weakness." Luffy's jaw tightened as he met the cold gaze of his relative. I do not see it as fraternizing, he replied, his voice quiet but firm. I see it as understanding. I see it as recognizing that the world we inherit is built on both light and shadow. To ignore the suffering around us is to ignore a part of ourselves. Lord Galen's eyes narrowed dangerously. Remember your place, Luffy. The legacy of our family is not one to be tarnished by the indiscretions of the heart. There is a time for duty and a time for indulgence. Do not let your misguided compassion lead you astray. Luffy said nothing, but inside, the words of his cousin only served to harden his resolve. Every admonition, every veiled threat, was a reminder of the chains that bound him, and of the price that might one day be demanded for defying them. As the rebellion continued to smolder in the lower quarters and whispers of change grew ever louder, the cost of Luffy's forbidden connection became increasingly evident. In the secret meetings with the Children of the Dawn, he began to see the faces of those who had sacrificed everything for the promise of a better future. Among them were people like Mira and Tomas, whose lives had been irrevocably altered by the cruelty of the regime. In their eyes, Luffy saw the reflection of his own growing determination, a determination that demanded not only change, but the willingness to risk everything. One fateful evening, the tension in the palace was palpable. Rumors of a crackdown on dissent had spread like wildfire. Guards were seen patrolling the servants' quarters with a new intensity, and the corridors seemed to whisper with caution and dread. In this charged atmosphere, Luffy and Rico met in their usual secret haven, a secluded courtyard hidden behind a crumbling wall where the scent of night-blooming jasmine mingled with the taste of impending danger. Rico's eyes were bright with urgency as she clasped Luffy's hand. They are tightening their grip, she murmured. The council has become aware of meetings, of whispers that threaten to unravel the old order. We must be careful. Luffy squeezed her hand gently. I know the risks, he said quietly, his voice heavy with determination. But if we do nothing, if we allow fear to dictate our lives, then what future is there for any of us? I cannot turn away from what I feel, even if it means challenging everything that has been built around me. Rico's gaze softened as she looked into his eyes. Then we must be brave together, she whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and hope. Our connection is not a crime, it is a beacon. It is the spark that can ignite change in the darkest of times. In that moment, the forbidden nature of their bond transformed from a source of peril into a rallying cry, a symbol of resistance against a system that sought to keep them apart. Yet both knew that the path ahead would be treacherous. Every secret meeting, every whispered word, was a step deeper into a labyrinth of danger and defiance. Amid the tightening scrutiny of the palace, an unexpected ally emerged from the ranks of the nobility, a young woman named Althea, whose intellect and quiet resolve had long set her apart from her peers. Though her status as a celestial dragon was unquestioned, Althea had always felt a disconnect with the ruthless traditions of her family. She had spent her days poring over forbidden texts and her nights listening to the discontent of those less privileged, and soon, she too became an unlikely champion of change. One crisp evening, as Luffy and Rico retreated to their secret meeting place in a forgotten wing of the palace, they were startled by the soft footsteps of someone approaching. Emerging from the shadows was Althea, her eyes alight with a mixture of apprehension and determination. Luffy, she said, addressing him with a familiarity that betrayed her noble upbringing. I have heard of your connection with Rico, and I know of the struggles you face. I, too, have long felt that the world we live in is built on lies and cruelty. Rico studied Althea warily, aware that any alliance between nobility and commoners was fraught with peril. Yet Luffy's expression was one of quiet welcome, a silent plea for unity against a common enemy. Tell us, Luffy urged. What do you propose? Althea's voice was soft but firm. There are ways for us to work together, she explained. I have been in contact with other like-minded nobles who have grown tired of the rigid hierarchy and the cruelty that defines our rule. We can use our influence to protect you, to help spread the message of change, but you must trust us, and trust that we are not content to simply stand by while injustice prevails. The prospect of an alliance between the worlds that had always been kept apart was intoxicating. For Luffy and Rico, it meant that their forbidden connection might not be an isolated spark of rebellion, but the beginning of a wildfire that could burn down the oppressive regime. And for Althea, It was a chance to redeem a legacy that had long been tarnished by cruelty. In the weeks that followed, the trio forged a delicate network of communication, a silent conspiracy woven into the very fabric of the palace. By day, Luffy attended his prescribed lessons and rituals, all the while concealing the turmoil that churned beneath his calm exterior. By night, he met with Rico and Althea in hidden rooms and secret passageways, their whispered plans growing bolder with each clandestine encounter. Late one night, in a narrow corridor lit only by the flickering flame of a single lantern, Luffy found himself alone with Rico. The tension of their secret alliance had become almost tangible, a palpable energy that pulsed between them. In that charged silence, their eyes met with an intensity that spoke of promises made in darkness and hopes that defied the strictures of their birth. "I worry every day that we will be discovered," Rico confessed, her voice barely above a whisper as she clutched Luffy's hand. "That one moment, everything we have built together will come crashing down." Luffy's response was soft yet resolute. "I understand your fear," he replied, his gaze steady and unyielding. "But if we allow fear to rule our hearts, then we have already lost. Our connection, our bond, is a gift. It is proof that even in the midst of darkness, light can be found." Their words, simple yet profound, resonated deep within both of them. It was a vow of mutual courage, a promise that no matter the cost, they would continue to defy the confines of a world determined to keep them apart. In that moment, the forbidden nature of their connection transformed into a symbol of hope, a reminder that the ties which bind can sometimes be the very things that set us free. Yet even as the bonds of trust and love deepened between Luffy, Rico, and their newfound allies, the specter of danger loomed ever larger. The palace, with its ancient walls and ever-watchful guards, was not a place where forbidden connections were tolerated lightly. Whispers of dissent had reached the ears of the regime's most ardent loyalists, and dark eyes now surveyed the corridors with increased vigilance. One rainy evening, as thunder rumbled distantly over the palace grounds, Luffy found himself summoned to a private audience with a high-ranking official, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was whispered about in hushed tones among the servants. Lord Severin, his face as stern as the carved stone of the ancient halls, regarded Luffy with a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed contempt. "You have been seen in places where you ought not to be, Luffy," Lord Severin intoned, his voice echoing in the cold chamber. "And your actions, though they may be cloaked in noble intentions, have not escaped our notice. I suggest you reconsider the paths you have chosen." Luffy's heart pounded as he met the unyielding gaze of the official. "I have only sought to understand the truth," he replied carefully, his voice betraying none of the turmoil inside. "If understanding leads to change, then I must follow that path, regardless of the cost." Lord Severin's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Be warned, boy," he said, his tone a dark promise. "The bonds you form, the connections you nurture, may prove to be your undoing. The law is clear, and deviation from tradition is met with swift retribution." That warning, delivered with all the subtlety of an executioner's edge, only served to strengthen Luffy's resolve. The forbidden connection he shared with Rico, and the alliance they had begun to forge with others like Althea, was now more precious than ever. It was the spark of a revolution, a fragile flame in a storm of tyranny, and as long as that flame burned, no force on earth could extinguish the light of hope it carried. In the quiet hours after his encounter with Lord Severin, Luffy found himself alone in his chamber, the weight of destiny pressing upon him like the heavy velvet drapes that lined his windows. His thoughts circled endlessly around the connection that had altered his life, an alliance born of shared dreams and nurtured in secret meetings. He could see clearly now that every moment spent with Rico, every risk taken to further their cause, was a rebellion against a system that thrived on division and cruelty. He took up a brush and carefully inscribed his thoughts onto parchment, the ink flowing with the fervor of a man who had tasted both the bitterness of oppression and the sweetness of forbidden love. In his writings, he promised himself that he would not falter, that no matter what trials lay ahead, he would protect this connection as fiercely as he protected the hope of a better future. His words were a testament to a newfound conviction that the true measure of nobility was not found in one's birth, but in the choices one made in the face of injustice. The days turned into nights and the nights into a blur of secret meetings and covert glances. In the corridors of the palace, Luffy and Rico's forbidden connection became an act of quiet rebellion, a declaration that love and understanding could flourish even in the harshest of environments. Their rendezvous grew longer, the moments they stole together filled with whispered plans and tender confessions. One night, under a sky freckled with stars, Rico led Luffy to a secluded terrace overlooking the city beyond the palace walls. There, the distant lights of a world unburdened by tyranny flickered like the hopes of 1,000 souls. Rico's eyes shone with unshed tears as she spoke of a future where every person, regardless of birth, would be free. "Every moment with you," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and determination, "reminds me that there is more to life than these gilded chains. I want to believe in a world where our love is not a crime, where our connection is celebrated rather than forbidden." Luffy pulled her close, the night air carrying away their whispered promises. "Then we will build that world," he vowed. "We will tear down the walls that separate us and create a future where no one is forced to hide who they truly are." Their embrace was a silent promise, a bond sealed not only by passion but by the unwavering belief in a future yet to be written. It was a moment that transcended the boundaries of class and duty, a spark of genuine humanity in a realm long ruled by cruelty. Yet even as their connection deepened, the undercurrent of danger grew stronger. The palace was tightening its grip on any sign of dissent. Rumors of Luffy's association with those deemed unworthy had reached the ears of those who would stop at nothing to preserve the old order. In whispered circles, servants and nobles alike spoke of the day when the rebellion would burst forth in a torrent of blood and fire. One evening, as Luffy and Althea reviewed plans for a new meeting of the Children of the Dawn, the tension in the air was nearly tangible. Maps of the palace, marked with secret routes and hidden passages, were spread out on a table in a forgotten corner of a rarely used wing. Althea traced her finger along the lines, her eyes flickering with both hope and concern. "We must move quickly," she said, her voice low. "Every moment we linger increases the risk that our activities will be exposed. The higher-ups are growing impatient, and I fear that it is only a matter of time before they begin their purge." Luffy's hand tightened around the edge of the map. "We will not be deterred," he declared, the fire in his eyes reflecting the determination of a man who had already defied his destiny. "Our connection, our rebellion, is our strength. We must remain united, even in the face of the coming storm." As the meeting drew to a close, each of them carried the burden of their secret alliance like a sacred trust. The forbidden connection between Luffy and Rico was now intertwined with the broader struggle for freedom, a struggle that demanded sacrifices, courage, and an unyielding commitment to a future built on justice. In the quiet moments after each clandestine meeting, as the palace slept and the whispers of rebellion mingled with the rustling of ancient trees, Luffy would often reflect on the path that lay ahead. The connection he shared with Rico, the solidarity with Althea and the others, was not merely an act of defiance. It was a declaration of hope. It was the promise that even in a world built on oppression, the human spirit could rise, could love, and could fight for a better tomorrow. He would sit by a narrow window, the pale light of dawn casting long shadows across his face, and allow himself to dream of a future where the barriers between nobility and commoners were shattered. In those dreams, the forbidden connection between him and Rico was celebrated, a symbol of a revolution that would change the very fabric of society. That morning, as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, Luffy took a deep breath and vowed to protect this connection at all costs. It was a promise made in the silence of a new day, a pledge that the bonds forged in secrecy and sacrifice would one day ignite the flames of change across the entire empire. As the chapter of forbidden connection closed on one day and the promise of another dawned, Luffy knew that every step he took from that moment forward was part of a larger, perilous journey. His heart, once bound by the constraints of a predetermined legacy, now beat in rhythm with the hopes of the oppressed and the defiant. In the stolen moments with Rico, in the quiet alliances with Althea and the Children of the Dawn, he had discovered a truth that transcended birth and blood, that love, in all its forms, was the most potent weapon against tyranny. And so, in the shadows of the palace, where secrets and dreams intertwined, Luffy embraced the forbidden connection that had become his strength. With every whispered promise, every tender touch, he wove a tapestry of rebellion, a tapestry that would, in time, transform the oppressive world around him into one where every soul was free to shine. For now, the connection was forbidden, its existence a dangerous secret that defied every law of the celestial dragons. But it was also the spark of a revolution, a spark that, if nurtured with courage and hope, would one day set the world ablaze with the light of true freedom. As the night deepened and the palace walls stood as silent witnesses to the unfolding drama, Luffy and Rico's forbidden connection became more than an act of rebellion. It became a beacon. A beacon that promised that even in the darkest corners of a corrupt empire, love and hope could flourish, defying the dictates of a cruel destiny. And in that light, the seeds of a new future were sown. A future where every connection, no matter how forbidden, could be the catalyst for a change that would shake the very foundations of a broken world. The moon hung low over the palace that night, a silvery sentinel presiding over secrets and sorrows. In the corridors and hidden alcoves of the celestial dragon estate, an undercurrent of dread had begun to ripple through the very stone. It was as if the ancient walls themselves whispered warnings of treachery, and every flicker of torchlight revealed not only the opulence of the regime but also the creeping tendrils of betrayal. For Luffy, who had dared to question the legacy of his bloodline and had taken up the mantle of rebellion, the night was about to unveil a truth far darker than he had ever imagined. Earlier that evening, as twilight bled into night, Luffy had slipped away from the formal gathering in the grand dining hall. His mind was a turbulent sea of doubts and determination, haunted by recent meetings with the Children of the Dawn and the forbidden warmth of his secret connection with Rico. Yet now, as he traversed the seldom-used corridor draped in shadows, a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. Something was amiss, an intuition that gnawed at him like an insistent whisper. He slowed his pace, every footstep echoing against the cold marble as he approached a narrow, unguarded passage near the servants' quarters. The corridor was quiet, too quiet, and the usual murmurs of nightly activity were absent. As he rounded a corner, he noticed a faint glimmer, a small, almost imperceptible piece of parchment, half hidden beneath a fallen mosaic tile. Luffy knelt to retrieve it. His heart pounded as he unrolled the fragile document, its ink barely visible in the dim light. The message was simple, almost childlike in its brevity, yet its implications were shattering. The truth of your rebellion is known. Trust no one. A friend, the words burned into his mind. Who could have sent such a message? Was it a warning from within the rebellion, a desperate cry from someone who had seen too much? Or was it a trap, orchestrated by those who sought to crush dissent from within the palace's hallowed halls? Luffy's thoughts raced, and an icy dread seeped into his veins. The betrayal was coming from the shadows, and he realized with a jolt that someone within his own circle might have turned traitor. Before the night could surrender any more of its secrets, Luffy resolved to confront his closest allies. In a hidden chamber behind a tapestry in the old library, a place where forbidden texts and clandestine plans were exchanged under the watchful eyes of history, he gathered Rico, Althea, and Tomas. The small group huddled together in a circle of flickering lamplight, the atmosphere thick with unspoken tension. Rico's eyes were wide with alarm as Luffy revealed the parchment. This is a warning," he murmured, his voice trembling with both fear and anger. "Someone is feeding information to our enemies. They know of our meetings. They know of our plans." Tomas, whose lined face bore the marks of a life spent in the shadows of power, furrowed his brow. "It cannot be a mere coincidence," he said in a gravelly tone. "There are always whispers of dissent, but to betray one's own, it is unthinkable." Althea's gaze was hard, resolute. "We must consider every possibility," she stated. "It is not only about our secret meetings, but about the trust we place in one another. If one of us has faltered, then our rebellion is in grave danger." Silence fell over the room. The fragile bonds that had held their clandestine alliance together now trembled under the weight of suspicion. Luffy felt the crushing pressure of responsibility. Every decision, every whispered conversation, might have been compromised. Shadows of betrayal lurked not only among their enemies but perhaps within their own ranks. "Who among us could it be?" Luffy demanded, his eyes searching each face. "Who has betrayed our trust?" Rico shook her head vehemently. I do not know. But we must tread carefully. Our enemies are cunning, and we must be even more so if we are to protect our cause." Tomas leaned forward, his voice low and somber. We need to review our recent communications, our meeting records. Any hint, any anomaly, anything that could reveal the traitor's identity. We cannot allow this betrayal to unravel everything we have fought for." The meeting ended with a heavy air of despair and determination. Luffy's mind churned with questions as he left the chamber, each step echoing the burden of a leader whose cause now teetered on the edge of collapse. In the following days, the rebellion's secret network transformed into a labyrinth of suspicion. Every whispered word and furtive glance became suspect. Luffy and his allies embarked on a covert investigation, retracing the routes of their clandestine meetings and scrutinizing every conversation for signs of betrayal. Luffy revisited the hidden alcoves and secret passages where he had once felt the exhilaration of defiance. Now, each shadow seemed to conceal an enemy, every quiet corner a potential den. He questioned the servants who had long aided their meetings, seeking out those who might have observed something amiss. In the dim light of the palace's lower quarters, a pattern of inexplicable delays and odd behaviors began to emerge. One night, while Luffy trailed a group of palace guards suspected of surveillance near the meeting rooms, he discovered a startling scene. In a deserted wing of the palace, he witnessed a figure slipping furtively into a storage room. The figure moved with deliberate haste, clutching a small bundle of documents. Luffy's heart hammered in his chest as he crept closer, every sense straining in the darkness. Peering through a crack in the door, he saw a man whose face he recognized all too well. It was Revan, a once trusted member of the rebellion whose sharp mind and resourcefulness had earned him a place among their inner circle. But now, in the pale glow of a single oil lamp, Revan's eyes were filled not with the fire of conviction but with a furtive, calculating glint. He carefully unrolled a set of papers, detailed records of their secret meetings, names, times, and locations, before tucking them into a leather pouch. Luffy's breath caught in his throat. Revan was the traitor. The revelation cut through him like a blade. For days he had suspected that someone in their midst had betrayed them, but to see it with his own eyes was almost too much to bear. The man who had once fought alongside him, who had shared in the dreams of a new world, was now an instrument of their undoing. Luffy's mind reeled with questions. Why had Revan turned against them? Was it fear, ambition, or something even darker? And most urgently, how many more secrets had he leaked? The betrayal was not merely a breach of trust. It was a wound that could cripple the rebellion from within. That night, beneath a sky heavy with foreboding clouds, Luffy resolved to confront Revan. In a secluded courtyard illuminated only by the ghostly light of a crescent moon, he arranged a meeting under the guise of discussing urgent matters. The courtyard, once a symbol of secret hope and whispered promises, now bore the weight of inevitable confrontation. Revan arrived, his posture wary yet defiant. The air between them was charged with unspoken tension as Luffy fixed him with a piercing gaze. "Revan," Luffy began slowly, "I have seen the evidence. I know what you have done." Revan's face hardened, his eyes darting briefly before settling on Luffy. "I did what was necessary," he replied coolly, though there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his inner conflict. "Our rebellion was doomed from the start, Luffy. The palace's grip is too strong. I sought a way to protect myself, perhaps to secure a future in a different manner. By betraying your brothers and sisters?" Luffy's voice was low and seething with hurt. "How can you justify selling our secrets, our lives, to those who would crush us without mercy?" Revan's gaze flickered with remorse for a moment before his expression turned steely. "You think you understand everything, Luffy. But you do not see the full picture. I believe that by cooperating, I could mitigate the damage, to guide our rebellion from the inside, perhaps even steer it away from self-destruction." "Steer it away from self-destruction?" Luffy repeated bitterly. "By feeding our plans to our enemies? By endangering every person who has dared to dream of freedom?" A tense silence enveloped them. The courtyard, with its crumbling stone and tangled ivy, bore silent witness to the collapse of trust between them. Finally Revan spoke, his voice barely audible over the whispering wind. "I had no choice, Luffy. They threatened my family. They said if I did not comply, they would destroy everything I hold dear." At those words, Luffy's anger faltered, replaced by a sorrow so profound it stung like acid. He had known that the cost of rebellion was steep, that every choice came with a sacrifice. Yet to learn that one of his own had been driven to betrayal by fear and coercion was a blow he was ill-prepared to endure. "You should have come to me," Luffy said softly, his voice heavy with anguish. "We could have faced it together. Instead, you chose to become a tool for our enemies." Revan's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but his resolve remained unbroken. "I am sorry, Luffy. I wish things could have been different. But I did what I had to do to survive. I never wanted to harm you or our cause." His tone was laden with regret, yet the damage had been done. The confrontation ended with no dramatic gestures, only the silent, unbearable truth of betrayal lingering between them. Luffy turned away, his heart a tumult of rage, sorrow, and a grim determination. The betrayal had cut deep, and he knew that even if Revan's motivations were born of desperation, the cost to their movement was incalculable. In the days that followed the confrontation, the rebellion's delicate balance teetered on the brink of collapse. The revelation of Revan's treachery sent ripples of distrust through their secret meetings. Whispers filled the hidden rooms and dark corridors where they once planned their revolution. Every member began to question every face, every word, a festering paranoia that threatened to splinter their unity. Rico, who had grown to trust Luffy with her very soul, was visibly shaken. In a quiet moment shared in a hidden garden, she looked into Luffy's eyes, searching for reassurance. "How can we ever trust anyone again?" she whispered, her voice trembling with grief and fear. Luffy's reply was measured, though the weight of betrayal was etched into every line of his face. "We must rebuild our trust, brick by brick. We cannot allow one act of betrayal to undo everything we have fought for. But we must also be vigilant. Our enemy has learned our secrets, and they will use them against us." Althea, ever the strategist, organized an emergency meeting with the remaining core members of the rebellion. In a cramped, candlelit chamber beneath the palace, she spread out maps and documents, her face set in a mask of determination. "We cannot allow this betrayal to be our undoing," she declared. "We must assume that every meeting, every conversation, is compromised until we root out every leak. We must double our security and reevaluate every protocol." Tomas, his voice rough with sorrow, added, "Revan's actions have not only given the enemy insight into our plans, they have shattered the trust that binds us. We must learn from this betrayal and become stronger. Our cause is larger than any one individual." Yet even as the rebellion rallied to fortify itself against further treachery, the cost of Revan's betrayal weighed heavily on them all. Luffy found himself haunted by memories of their once unified front, each face now shadowed by suspicion. In quiet moments, he would wander the palace's hidden corridors alone, grappling with a profound sense of loss, a feeling that the rebellion itself had been tarnished by the sting of betrayal. As if the internal strife were not enough, the palace authorities began to exploit the newfound vulnerabilities with ruthless precision. Lord Severin, emboldened by the revelation of the traitor within the rebellion, initiated a series of purges. The corridors that had once sheltered whispered hopes now reverberated with the heavy steps of armed guards, their eyes scanning every shadow for signs of dissent. One cold morning, as dawn's first light barely penetrated the heavy gloom of the palace, alarms shattered the silence. A covert raid was launched on one of the secret meeting spots, a storeroom in the lower quarters where members of the Children of the Dawn had gathered. Chaos erupted as guards stormed the room, their commands echoing off the stone walls. Shouts, clattering of weapons, and the desperate cries of those caught off guard filled the air. Luffy raced to the scene, his heart pounding with a mix of fury and despair. When he arrived, he found a scene of devastation, documents scattered on the floor, frightened faces frozen in terror, and the unmistakable stench of betrayal thick in the air. Rico was among the survivors, her eyes wide with horror as she clutched a blood-stained handkerchief. Althea and Tomas fought valiantly to fend off the attackers, but the damage had been done. The enemy had gained not only intelligence but a moral victory, a demonstration that the rebellion was vulnerable from within. In the aftermath of the raid, as the survivors gathered in a hidden safe house, the true cost of the betrayal became painfully clear. Lives had been lost, and the carefully built network of hope was now fractured by mistrust and fear. The enemy's advantage was stark. Every secret, every plan, was now tainted by the shadow of betrayal. Luffy addressed the group in a hushed, anguished tone. We have been wounded, and our trust has been broken. But we cannot let this defeat us. We must learn from this pain, become more resilient. Our enemy thrives on our divisions. We must unite, if not in blind faith, then in the strength of our shared purpose. His words, though stirring, did little to dispel the bitter taste of treachery that lingered in every heart. The rebellion was at a crossroads, a moment where the shadows of betrayal threatened to engulf all that they had built. In the solitary hours after the raid, Luffy sought refuge in a forgotten courtyard far from prying eyes. The moon's pale glow illuminated the ruins of an old fountain, its waters long dried up, a silent testament to lost dreams. As he sat on a crumbling stone bench, the weight of betrayal pressed down on him. Every betrayal, every broken promise, echoed in the silence, and he found himself questioning whether the cost of rebellion was too high. He thought of Revan, the man who had once been a comrade, a friend, and how his desperate choices had precipitated a cascade of consequences. Luffy's heart ached with a profound sadness, and tears blurred his vision as he silently vowed that he would not let this treachery define the future. Yet deep within him, a spark of determination flickered, a defiant light amid the gathering darkness. The betrayal had revealed a harsh truth. The enemy was not only outside the palace walls, but could also reside in the hearts of those closest to him. And yet, in that very moment of despair, Luffy resolved to rebuild what had been lost. Trust, once shattered, might be pieced together again, but only if every member of the rebellion was willing to face the painful truths of their own vulnerabilities. In the days that followed, Luffy, Rico, Althea, and the remaining loyal members of the rebellion worked tirelessly to mend the fractures that betrayal had wrought. Meetings were held under stricter security, and protocols were rewritten to ensure that no further leaks could jeopardize their cause. Every new plan was tempered by caution, every hopeful word weighed against the memory of treachery. Yet in the midst of rebuilding, Luffy found solace in the quiet moments shared with Rico. In a secluded nook of the palace gardens, where the remnants of once proud fountains still whispered of lost eras, they clung to each other, as if their bond alone could defy the forces that sought to tear them apart. Under a canopy of starlight, Rico's gentle touch and soft-spoken reassurances offered a brief respite from the harsh reality of betrayal. "Even in the darkest night," she whispered, "we must believe that a new dawn will come." Her words, though tender, carried the weight of shared grief and unyielding hope. And in that moment, Luffy realized that while betrayal could fracture trust, it could also illuminate the need for unity, a call to rebuild stronger than before. As the rebellion slowly began to heal, the threat of further betrayal lingered like a specter over every meeting and every whispered plan. Every member was now a vigilant guardian of their own secrets, every conversation measured and guarded. The price of vigilance was high, a constant reminder that the enemy could be lurking in every shadow, waiting for the slightest misstep. Luffy knew that the scars of this betrayal would remain long after the wounds had healed. The pain of lost trust, of comrades turned traitors, would haunt him for years to come. But in that pain lay a lesson. The price of freedom was steep, and the struggle for a better world demanded sacrifices that none could fully prepare for. Determined to honor the sacrifices of those who had suffered, Luffy began to document the lessons learned from the betrayal. In secret journals and coded messages, he recorded every detail, the missteps, the warnings, the moments of weakness. These records were not merely a chronicle of failure but a roadmap for a more resilient future. They would serve as both a reminder and a guide, that in the face of betrayal, one must adapt, learn, and ultimately rise stronger. Despite the pervasive darkness that now cloaked the rebellion, even amid shattered alliances and the ever-present threat of retribution, a flicker of hope endured. It was a hope born not of naive optimism, but of the resolute belief that the human spirit, even when wounded, had the capacity to heal and to fight on. Every act of defiance, every moment of courage in the face of betrayal, added a new layer to the tapestry of their struggle. A tapestry that, though marred by shadows, still shimmered with the promise of redemption. In one particularly moving moment, Luffy found himself alone in a quiet annex of the palace, a small room lined with books and relics of a bygone era. There, in the silence punctuated by the soft hum of his thoughts, he read a passage from one of the ancient texts of his lineage. "In the heart of darkness, the light of truth burns ever bright. Though betrayed and scarred, the soul that seeks justice shall rise anew. tempered like steel in the crucible of despair. Those words resonated deeply with him. They encapsulated the bitter reality of their struggle, and the unyielding hope that, even in betrayal, there was the possibility of renewal. And so, with renewed determination, Luffy vowed that the rebellion would endure. The shadows of betrayal might stretch long and dark, but they would never extinguish the flame of defiance that burned within him and his comrades. In the weeks and months that followed, the rebellion slowly regained its footing. New alliances were forged, old wounds began to mend, and the lessons of betrayal were woven into the very fabric of their resolve. Yet every step forward was taken with eyes wide open, every plan constructed with the hard-earned wisdom of past failures. Luffy, now more than ever, became a symbol of resilience, a leader whose heart had been shattered and rebuilt through the crucible of betrayal. He took every precaution, every measure to ensure that trust, once broken, would not be so easily exploited again, and in his private moments, when the weight of responsibility threatened to overwhelm him, he would recall the cold night when the parchment had foretold the betrayal, and the anguished confrontation with Revan. Those memories, painful as they were, served as a constant reminder of the cost of vigilance and the price of hope. As dusk fell one final time over the palace, casting long, wavering shadows across its storied walls, Luffy stood atop a quiet balcony overlooking the sprawling grounds. The cool night air carried with it the bittersweet scent of jasmine and rain, a fragrance that spoke of loss, but also of the promise of renewal. In that moment, Luffy allowed himself a brief respite from the constant vigilance and heartache. He closed his eyes and listened to the silent echoes of the past, the betrayals, the lost trust, and the painful sacrifices. He knew that the shadows of betrayal would forever be a part of his story. They would haunt him in moments of quiet reflection and emerge in unexpected ways. But he also knew that those very shadows had forged him into a leader capable of rising above the darkness. The scars of betrayal were not marks of weakness, but of survival, of a spirit that refused to be broken, no matter how deep the wounds. Looking out over the palace, Luffy whispered a promise to the night. "We will rebuild stronger than before. Our trust may be shattered, but from the fragments we will craft a future where betrayal has no place, where every act of courage lights the way to a new dawn." In the distance, the first light of morning began to edge the horizon, a quiet prelude to a day filled with uncertainty, challenge, and the relentless pursuit of justice. And though the shadows of betrayal still lingered, they served as a reminder of the cost of freedom, and of the unyielding resolve required to claim it. The aftermath of betrayal and the bitter lessons learned in the shadows had left the palace echoing with a somber resolve. Yet amid the rubble of shattered trust and wounded hope, Luffy's spirit burned brighter than ever. Determined to transform loss into the foundation of a revolution, he began to seek out those whose hearts had been scarred by the cruelty of the celestial dragons, a motley band of souls long cast aside by the oppressive regime. Their lives, once fragmented and isolated, were about to converge into a force that could upend an empire. In the early light of a chill autumn morning, Luffy stood atop a secluded balcony in the eastern wing of the palace. The sky was streaked with hues of lavender and rose as dawn broke, its light mingling with the lingering shadows of the night. Every ray of sunlight that filtered through the high, arched windows whispered of freedom, a freedom so desperately needed that it had become the heartbeat of his rebellion. Clutching a small, worn medallion, an heirloom of his once unchallenged lineage, Luffy closed his eyes and took a deep breath. In that quiet moment, he recalled the faces of those he had met: Rico, whose gentle defiance had ignited a fire in his soul; Althea, whose strategic brilliance and quiet courage had begun to mend the fractures of trust; Tomas, whose scars bore witness to a lifetime of suppressed grief; and many others whose names were yet unspoken. He knew that the strength of their future lay not in the privileges of noble birth but in the resilience of the human spirit. "Today, we build a new legacy," Luffy murmured to himself, his voice barely audible over the soft rustle of the morning breeze. "We gather the outcast, the lost, the forgotten, and we show them that together, we can break these chains." That very morning, Luffy began his journey through the lower decks and hidden corridors of the palace. Every step took him farther from the world of opulence that had both sheltered and imprisoned him and closer to the realm of those who had been cast aside by the celestial order. His path wound through narrow, dimly lit passageways where the echoes of whispered sorrows and quiet indignation resonated. He paused at each door, his gaze lingering on faded signs and worn stone that bore the history of hardship. At the heart of the servants' quarter, in a modest barracks where the strong and the downtrodden shared space beneath battered rafters, Luffy encountered his first outcast, a man whose reputation for skill with a blade was matched only by the burdens of his past. Known simply as Katsuro, he was once the heir of a disgraced noble family whose honor had been stripped away by the unyielding tyranny of the celestial dragons. Katsuro's presence was unmistakable even in the dim glow of a single oil lamp. Lean and sinewy, with eyes like storm clouds and a gaze that seemed to hold both sorrow and unspoken defiance, he was a man who had learned to fight not just for survival but for redemption. His sword, an elegantly forged blade with scars of countless battles, hung at his side, a silent testament to the many struggles that had marked his journey. Luffy approached him cautiously, aware that trust was a luxury rarely afforded in these desperate times. "Katsuro," Luffy began, his voice steady yet gentle. "I have heard of your skill and your suffering. I know you have been cast aside by those who once claimed you were noble. But I see in you the spark of a warrior who has not given up hope." Katsuro's eyes narrowed as he studied the young celestial dragon, the irony not lost on him that someone born of the very system that had betrayed him now sought to change it. "Why should I trust you?" he asked, his tone measured and guarded. "You come from a lineage built on cruelty and entitlement." Luffy's gaze burned with a mix of pain and determination. "I was born into that darkness, but I have chosen to seek the light. I know the cost of betrayal, the weight of injustice, and I refuse to let that define my future. Katsuro, join me, and let us forge a new path, a path where honor is not inherited, but earned through the courage to stand for what is right." For a long moment, silence reigned between them. Finally, Katsuro lowered his head, as if weighing the gravity of the decision. "I have long carried my sword as both shield and burden," he said quietly. "If your vision is true, then perhaps it is time for me to cast aside the chains of my past. I will stand with you." Their handshake was firm, a pact sealed in mutual respect and the shared resolve to overturn an unjust order. Katsuro's addition to the fledgling rebellion was a clarion call to others who had suffered in silence. Not far from the barracks, in the labyrinthine alleys of the palace's lower quarters, Luffy sought the counsel of a mind as sharp as it was unyielding. Known among the outcasts as Kai, this cunning strategist had spent years evading the cruel clutches of the celestial enforcers. His intelligence and resourcefulness had earned him a reputation as a master of secrets, a man who could decipher the coded language of rebellion and plot a course through a maze of danger. Kai's hideout was a cramped, cluttered room hidden behind a false wall in an abandoned storeroom. Maps of the palace, scribbled notes, and scattered trinkets of rebellion cluttered every surface, evidence of a life dedicated to planning and subterfuge. As Luffy entered, he was greeted by the sight of Kai hunched over a roughly drawn map, his eyes glinting with an intensity that belied his modest surroundings. "Ah, you must be the one they call Luffy," Kai said, his tone laced with a mixture of curiosity and respect. "I have been expecting you. I have seen the signs, whispers in the dark corridors that speak of change. But tell me, what makes you think that our cause can ever overcome the might of the celestial dragons?" Luffy's answer was resolute. "Because hope is stronger than oppression, and unity is the antidote to tyranny. We are not defined by the blood in our veins, but by the strength of our convictions. I have already seen betrayal, fear, and suffering. Now I seek those who are willing to stand together, to plot a future that values every life." Kai leaned back, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "You speak with the fire of conviction, young master. I too have seen the worst of this regime. I have lost much to their greed and cruelty. I have been forced to live in the shadows, but in the darkness, I have learned to read the secrets of our enemy. I will join you. Together, we shall map a course to our freedom." Kai's agreement was more than a promise. It was the merging of a brilliant mind with the fervor of a heart determined to fight against insurmountable odds. His plans and strategies would soon prove invaluable as the rebellion began to crystallize into a tangible force. As word of Luffy's mission began to spread, quietly, like the first whispers of a coming storm, a third figure emerged from the depths of personal tragedy. A young woman known as Mira had long served as a beacon of compassion among the commoners. Her gentle smile belied the hardships she had endured, and her steadfast loyalty to those who suffered made her a cherished friend to many. Once a servant in the palace, Mira had seen her family torn apart by the merciless policies of the celestial dragons, leaving her with scars that ran deeper than any visible wound. Mira was tending a small garden behind an old, crumbling wall, a patch of earth where she grew wild herbs and flowers as a tribute to resilience, when Luffy found her. Her hands were stained with the rich, dark soil, and her eyes, though tired, sparkled with an inner light that seemed to defy the grim realities of her existence. "Master Luffy," she greeted him softly, a mixture of surprise and warmth in her voice. "I have heard of your cause, and I have witnessed the suffering that plagues our people. I cannot stand idly by while the cruelty of our masters robs us of our dignity. If I can help even a little, I will give everything I have." Luffy knelt beside her, his expression earnest. "Mira, your strength and kindness are what bind us together. You have seen the pain of our people up close, and you understand that change is not something granted by birth but won through sacrifice and solidarity. Will you join us in our quest for a new future?" With a nod and a quiet determination, Mira placed her calloused hand in his. "I will stand with you, Luffy. My past is filled with loss, but it has also taught me that every life matters. I will help heal the wounds of our people, even if it means risking everything." Her pledge was met with a silent affirmation from Luffy, a promise that together, they would create a tapestry of hope woven from the threads of their shared suffering and unwavering resolve. Over the next several days, as the whispers of rebellion rippled through the dark underbelly of the celestial regime, Luffy's cadre of outcasts began to swell. Word spread discreetly among those who had been cast aside. A meeting was to be held in a forgotten courtyard beneath the old ramparts of the palace, a neutral ground where the downtrodden could gather without fear of reprisal. Under the cloak of night, in a desolate courtyard overgrown with ivy and lit only by the soft luminescence of a few stray lanterns, a diverse assembly of souls began to converge. They came from all corners of the palace's vast, cruel network. There was a weathered ex-officer who had once enforced the brutal edicts of the celestial dragons but now carried the burden of remorse. A skilled artisan, whose delicate hands had crafted the ornate decorations of the noble halls, now wielded those skills to forge symbols of rebellion. Even a quiet, unassuming scholar who had long toiled in the dusty archives to preserve the true history of their people had emerged from the shadows. Luffy stood at the center of the gathering, his presence commanding despite his youth. The air was thick with anticipation as he addressed the motley assembly, a congregation of outcasts united by a shared vision of a better tomorrow. "Friends," Luffy began, his voice clear and resolute, "we are gathered here not as enemies of our birth, but as champions of our future. We have all suffered under the weight of an unjust legacy. But tonight we take the first step toward reclaiming our destiny. You are not defined by your past, nor by the cruelty of those who would see you broken. You are defined by your courage, your resilience, and the strength of your hearts." A murmur of agreement swept through the crowd, faces once hardened by despair softening into expressions of hope. Katsuro's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, Kai's eyes shone with calculating ambition, Myra's gentle smile radiated quiet determination, and many others, each with their own story of hardship, listened intently. Luffy continued, "Our journey will not be easy. The forces we oppose are vast and unyielding. But together, we have the power to change the course of history. We will gather intelligence, share our skills, and protect one another. We will be the outcasts that defy the tyranny of the celestial dragons and build a future where every soul is free to live with dignity and honor." As his words echoed across the courtyard, a palpable energy surged through the assembly, a surge that transcended differences in birth, occupation, or past grievances. In that moment, the outcasts were bound together by a single, unyielding purpose: to challenge a legacy built on cruelty and to forge a new destiny with their own hands. After the initial fervor of Luffy's address, the gathering slowly broke into smaller clusters. In hushed corners of the courtyard, individuals began to share their stories, tales of loss, betrayal, and survival that had been hidden away for far too long. An older man, his face etched with the lines of endless hardship, spoke of his days as a palace guard, a position he had been forced into at a young age. I was once tasked with upholding the law, he said, his voice trembling with regret. But I soon realized that the law was nothing more than a tool to keep us in chains. I lost my honor and my family to this cruel system. Now, I seek only redemption. A young woman, her eyes bright with unshed tears, recounted how her entire village had been razed by the celestial enforcers, a brutal punishment for daring to dream of a life free from oppression. They called us rebels, she whispered, but we were only human. We deserve to live without fear. I stand here now, not to dwell on the pain of the past, but to fight for a future where such atrocities never occur again. As these voices rose and fell in the night, the shared pain and resilience of the outcasts wove a tapestry of sorrow and hope. Each story was a reminder of the cost of injustice and a call to arms for a new era of compassion and freedom. Kai, ever the strategist, took note of every detail. Our strength lies in our understanding of the enemy, he declared softly to Katsuro and a few others gathered nearby. They feed on our despair. But if we can harness our pain and turn it into determination, we can outmaneuver them at every turn. Katsuro, his sword resting by his side, added, My blade has tasted the bitterness of betrayal. But every cut, every scar, reminds me that we must fight with honor, and that honor is born from our struggle against tyranny. Luffy listened to every word, feeling the weight of their collective past and the promise of their shared future. In that forgotten courtyard, far from the gilded halls of the celestial dragons, a new brotherhood was being forged, one that transcended social boundaries and united individuals in a common cause. With the gathering of outcasts now in full swing, it was time to move from words to deeds. Luffy called for a second assembly, this time with a clear agenda: to strategize, to share intelligence, and to allocate roles based on the unique strengths of each member. In a makeshift command room, a repurposed storage chamber with a single, cracked window that allowed a sliver of moonlight to filter through, the leaders of the rebellion convened. Althea, with her analytical mind and innate sense of order, unfurled a large map of the palace and its surrounding districts. Our first priority, she began, is to secure safe routes for our operations. The palace is a labyrinth, and we must know every hidden passage, every overlooked entrance. Kai, your knowledge of the corridors will be invaluable here. Kai stepped forward, pointing to various markings on the map with precise gestures. There are secret passageways beneath the servants' quarters, tunnels that lead to the outer walls, and even forgotten storerooms that can serve as temporary hideouts. We must use these routes to transport supplies, move between meetings undetected, and communicate without fear of interception. Mira, standing quietly at the back, added her own insights drawn from years of experience among the commoners. The people outside these walls, those who live in the shadow of the palace, are our greatest asset. They have seen the cruelty of our masters up close. We must organize covert networks among them. Every alley, every marketplace is a potential safe haven. Katsuro's voice, steady and resolute, resonated as he proposed a plan for defense. Our enemies will come for us. We must be ready to defend our meeting points. I will train a small cadre of fighters from among our ranks, those willing to stand guard and protect our plans. Our strength in battle will be matched by our unity in purpose. Luffy listened, his eyes burning with fervor as he absorbed each contribution. We are outcasts, he said, but we are also the architects of a new future. Each of you has suffered, but your pain has made you strong. Today, we do more than share our stories. We forge a plan to reclaim our lives and dismantle the tyranny that has oppressed us for so long. As the meeting progressed, roles were assigned, tasks were delegated, and every member was given a specific responsibility. The outcasts, once scattered and broken, were now united under a single banner, their diverse talents forming the pillars of a growing rebellion. Later that night, after the strategic meeting had drawn to a close and the outcasts began to disperse into the labyrinth of hidden passages, Luffy found a quiet moment to reflect on the transformation that had taken place. He wandered into a secluded courtyard, where the soft glow of a solitary lantern illuminated a mosaic of faces, each etched with the trials of the past, yet aglow with the promise of a better future. In that reflective solitude, Luffy recalled the promise he had made on the balcony in the early light of dawn, to gather those who had been cast aside, to unite them in the common pursuit of justice, and to prove that even in the face of overwhelming oppression, the human spirit could rise triumphant. Every outcast gathered that night was a testament to that promise, a living symbol that from the depths of despair, hope could be reborn. He understood now more clearly than ever that the strength of the rebellion did not lie solely in its numbers, but in the unity of its purpose. Each story shared in the courtyard, the anguish of lost honor, the quiet resilience of those who had suffered, and the burning desire for change, wove together into a fabric of defiance that could not be torn apart by fear or betrayal. Luffy resolved that he would protect these bonds at all costs. "We are more than the sum of our scars," he whispered to the night, "and together we are unstoppable." In the days and weeks that followed, as the outcasts integrated into a cohesive force, Luffy and his newfound allies began to test the limits of their plans. Small missions were launched to gather intelligence, disrupt the oppressive operations of the celestial dragons, and spread the seeds of rebellion among the people. Every success, no matter how minor, was celebrated as a victory against a system designed to crush hope. Kai led covert expeditions through the maze-like corridors of the palace, mapping out every safe passage and secret exit. Katsuro organized training sessions for a fledgling militia, instilling in them the discipline and valor required to protect the movement. Mira, with her gentle wisdom, nurtured networks among the commoners, turning whispers of dissent into rallying cries for change. One crisp evening, as the outcasts gathered once more in the now familiar courtyard, Luffy addressed them with a vision that transcended the darkness of their past. "We have proven that the spirit of rebellion cannot be silenced," he declared. "Every obstacle we overcome, every secret route we discover, every act of courage, these are the building blocks of a future where no one lives under the yoke of oppression." Faces that had once been etched with despair now shone with determination. In that moment, the gathering of the outcasts was no longer a scattered collection of lost souls. It had become a united front, a brotherhood and sisterhood forged in the fires of injustice and bound by the promise of a new era. Althea stepped forward, her voice resolute as she added, "Let this be the dawn of a new age, an age where the outcasts of today become the leaders of tomorrow. We will show the world that hope, when united with courage, can shatter even the strongest chains." As the crowd erupted in a quiet but fervent cheer, the air itself seemed to shimmer with the possibility of transformation. The celestial dragons, entrenched in their gilded prisons of privilege, could never have foreseen the power that could arise from the discarded and the downtrodden. In that gathering of outcasts, a revolution was not only being planned, it was being born. That night, as the assembled outcasts dispersed into the hidden corners of the palace and the city beyond, Luffy remained in the courtyard for a long time. He gazed up at the star-strewn sky, feeling for the first time in years the exhilarating promise of destiny. Each star was a spark of hope, a reminder that even in the vast darkness, light persisted. He thought of the faces he had met, the swordsman seeking redemption, the strategist whose mind cut through the labyrinth of tyranny, the loyal friend whose gentle spirit defied the cruelty of fate, and he realized that the true power of their rebellion lay not in weapons or plans, but in the unity of their hearts. Together, they were a beacon of resistance. Together, they could illuminate the path toward a future free from oppression. In that silent communion with the night, Luffy made a solemn vow that every outcast gathered, every life redeemed, and every spark of hope nurtured would serve as a stepping stone to dismantle the old order. He promised that their collective struggle, born of pain and honed by unity, would one day lead to the dawn of a new era, an era where every soul, regardless of birth or circumstance, would be free. And so, as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the outcasts of the celestial dragon's realm took their first steps into a future defined not by the chains of the past, but by the unbreakable bonds of shared purpose. Their journey was just beginning, a journey filled with uncertainty, danger, and sacrifice. But it was a journey fueled by the fierce belief that from the depths of despair, a brighter world could be built. In that transformative moment, the gathering of the outcasts was complete, a mosaic of broken pieces coming together to form a masterpiece of rebellion and hope. And as they dispersed to carry out their missions, the legacy of that night would echo through the ages, a testament to the power of unity and the enduring strength of the human spirit.